It seems everyone, everywhere, is thirsty.
Code Vein is a Japanese action RPG where you play an anime vampire called a Revenant in a post-catastrophe world where staving off your thirst for blood is a daily struggle. Except that only happens to the main characters one time each, so it's more Blade than Dracula. It also had a Domino's Pizza sign in the base during the beta, and that sign being removed disappoints me more than anything else about this game. Code Vein was developed by Shift and published by Bandai Namco, the respective developer and publisher of the God Eater games, a series of action RPGs revolving around fighting monsters in a grim post-apocalyptic world. They also published some other game that a lot of people like. I can't really remember what it's called right now, but I'm sure it's not important. People aren't going to make a bunch of comparisons between the two. Hey, that's cool. There's a God Eater weapon set. That's a fun reference. Oh, they even got UFO Table to do an anime opening like they did for the God Eater games. Piling on the reference is pretty heavy here, but I can appreciate the desire to carry God Eater fans over, and I can't really knock them for borrowing from themselves. Luckily for those of us who don't have time to play 3 games and watch an anime before starting this one, this isn't God Eater 4, and as an original IP, it makes a bloody good showing. Upon starting the game, you're immediately thrown into the first boss fight, crippling creative freedom. You give your character a name, and also a code name, which feels like a weirdly unnecessary holdover from God Eater, and then it's off to the character creator, where you'll be able to create the anime girl of your dreams. There's a ridiculous amount of customization available in terms of skin, hair, and eyes, including settings for heterochromia, which I'm always happy to see in a game. You can even increase the size of your anime titties, although strictly speaking it's a physique slider that changes multiple things as opposed to the dedicated tits slider that Saints Row 3 has. Although some turbo nerd somewhere is very upset about the lack of a dedicated OPI slider, the character creator here is extremely robust, and it's probably one of the best ones I've used in a game, seeing as how on 2 occasions I spent over an hour working on a character without feeling bad about it or feeling like I needed to hurry up and get into the game. It was liberating to not have any sliders to tweak, as it avoids my recurring nightmare of spending 20 minutes fine-tuning my character's cheekbones only to realize they look great in profile and like some sort of flesh monster from the front, and there's plenty of options to make your ideal Revenant. I appreciated hairstyles not being locked to either gender, letting me be a vampire tomboy and an emo Alucard respectively, and while I wanted to fit into the game world, it's great that the creative freedom to look completely ridiculous exists for people that don't want to take things so seriously. If I had to gripe about it at all, it'd be to say that the clothing options are a bit sparse and the accessory limit feels really arbitrary. I assume it's to keep players from self-destructing their frame rate, but if that's the case, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that one belt option costs 4 points while another costs 2, despite likely having a similar impact on performance. In any case, once you've spent long enough in the character creator to pass the Steam refund cutoff, it's time to get into the game. You'll begin with a fairly quick tutorial, and if you can handle the proper nouns disease, you'll start to figure out how this game plays differently from its peers. I want to go in depth on the combat in a bit, but the short version is that it's overall fast, there's no shields, and you're encouraged to dodge and parry over guarding, giving it more in common with Bloodborne than with Dark Souls. After the tutorial, you awaken in a ruined city, and the first thing you see is nice. The game is a slow start by virtue of being a Japanese game, and is vague by virtue of being kind of like Dark Souls. But aside from Amnesiac protagonist being a bit of a generic way to start, the plot is workable and has a solid expansion of scale and stakes. It's not a masterclass in world building, but it gets the job done, so it's fine. Visual design is also fine for the environments, with characters and enemies looking pretty good. Your allies are a likable bunch, in no small part because the men are beautiful boys and the ladies are drawn exactly like you'd expect from a Japanese character designer. There's also the hunter and his companion, whose distinct facial scars do a good job of reminding you that these characters are immortal undead instead of your average teenage anime protagonists. Enemies are creepy and well-suited to the biomes you find them in, although those are a mixed bag. There's a ruined city, obligatory themed areas of fire, ice, water, and Anakin's nightmares, as well as more architecturally focused areas that demonstrate gothic and brutalist influences. From a visual standpoint, they run from fine, if dull, to gorgeous, with the best-looking area shown off before the halfway point of the game, while the last zone before the final boss is a dull blur in my memory. From a mechanical perspective, I appreciated the remixes on gameplay they offered, like the sand zone restricting where you can move without losing MP, and the ice zone being the only one where falling is a real threat. That last point is probably my biggest complaint about the level design. Unlike Dark Souls, you can't be sent off a fatal drop by your own rolls or attack animations, making knockbacks from enemies and actually walking off the only means of death by gravity. That doesn't stop combat from constantly taking place on perilously narrow ground. It's like the developers looked to that game for influence, but the level designers just binged the Dunk Souls trilogy before they got started. That said, my real scorn for the level design is reserved for the zone that's definitely the prettiest to look at, but spikes my blood pressure to even think about slogging through again.
Welcome to Hell, Walker. We've been waiting for you.
This is the Cathedral of the Sacred Blood, an area that's best described as Anor Londo in the streets and Blighttown in the sheets. It's a beautiful area that made me stop to take it all in when I arrived. It's also a sadistic labyrinth so full of dead ends, locked doors, and fatal drops that after the 6 hours it took me to find my way to the boss room, I never wanted to see it again. It's like an M.C. Escher painting that hates you. It's like trying to escape a Mobius strip made into a bridge, and sometimes the correct way to move forward is to listen to the voices and just jump. It's an exercise in suffering so long that there's an intermission that takes you to a different zone just to mix things up, and your reward for making it to the end of Gothic Hell is a boss that I finished on the first try. It's a masterclass in infuriating design, and the only bright spot is that I think the game really picks up after the Cathedral. It also coincides with one of 2 times where the difficulty spikes upwards as opposed to curving, which seems like a good enough time to clumsily segue into talking about the combat. Code Vein has what you might expect from this style of action RPG. You have light and heavy attacks, spells, dodging, blocking, and parrying, and I think it all plays quite well, but what surprised and delighted me was the amount of flexibility that exists with how you interact with these systems. Instead of committing to one class or particular stat configuration, you switch between blood codes. These blood codes, or character classes, for those of us that aren't fluent in Weeaboo, determine your stats, encumbrance, and gifts, which translates out of High Weeb to spells and abilities. These gifts can be the core of your damage as a caster, or provide buffs as a fighter, and all cost Ichor, or mana, which can only be restored through physical attacks or items. It's a good way of encouraging you to mix it up in combat, and the ability to cross-class gifts and use them outside their original blood code gives a ton of flexibility in terms of how you build. There's 5 weapon types, great swords and the other ones, as well as magic in dark and light varieties, and although I feel like an anime girl swinging a great sword the size of Fat Pikachu is the way it's meant to be played, all of the playstyles I've tried were at least valid, if less satisfying. I had a good time experimenting with different combinations of blood codes, gifts, weapons, and armor, and being able to switch between them all in the same save file was refreshing. Combat is also defined by your ability to bring one of several partners with you, who all have different combat styles and a shared ability to revive you when you'd otherwise be killed. I've heard complaints that this makes the game too easy, but you can go it alone if you want the added challenge, so I don't feel like that argument merits much engagement. If anything, I'd have preferred the option to switch your AI partner out in favor of true co-op instead of the summon-based system that only partners you up until you beat the current boss. The bosses themselves are pretty good overall. The worst were inoffensive, and the best were so good that I'd go as far as to say they stand out in the genre as a whole, with attacks that are well communicated to the player, satisfying to avoid, and punishing to get hit by, but there's also one that's fantastic on a thematic level just as much as it is on a mechanical one, and that's where we get into spoiler territory. If you haven't played Code Vein yet and you've liked what you've seen so far, I recommend that you do. You can skip to here for my wrap-up. If you did play it and want confirmation of your existing opinion or want to know what I think about that thing, let's dig into the plot. I feel like it's difficult to structure my thoughts on Code Vein's plot without jumping around due to its in medias res presentation and reliance on memory echoes to tell the backstory, with all but the most critical ones made optional to explore at any time or not at all. I thought the memory echoes themselves were good, but there's no good time to explore them without dragging down the pacing, as you're either going back to the base for small exposition dumps when you get a new vestige, or saving them up and sitting through an anime-length exposition dump when you realize it's probably a good idea to do all of these. It certainly doesn't help you invest in the characters who are never encountered outside the echoes. Despite being a more important character in Yakumo's memories than Yakumo himself, the thing that stuck with me the most about Riki is how the cast couldn't seem to agree on whether his name is pronounced Riki or Ricky. In the interest of this video not being 30 minutes long, I'm gonna move on by saying the best echoes were Murasame's, and if you disagree, I get where you're coming from, but you should probably glance over at the title of this video and adjust your wrong opinions accordingly. The plot does a good job of building mystery, although I'd say it's 50-50 on satisfying payoffs. The first mystery of what makes you so special that Rei Ayanami only wants to hang out with you resolves satisfyingly in your memories, where it's revealed that you drained the queen's blood, inadvertently becoming the first successor. This is actually great show don't tell, as it's placed before your first encounter with another successor, and you can reasonably conclude that you're a successor before you're outright told as much, since all the Rei clones are hanging out with other successors. The problem with that is that an hour into the game, Louis asserts that your blood code is broken and you're a void type. That first part is right, but if being a void type refers to your blood code being broken, it's weird that there's a name for it when you don't run into any others like you, and if it refers to your powers as a successor, it's weird that there's a name for it because Louis hasn't seen anything like it. They could have never uttered the words void type, and the mystery of why you're just way cooler than the other evidence would have still resolved meaningfully. As is, it seems like Louis just made up a term to sound cool. Like a nerd. The second half plot with the successors was a solid setup, and although each successor having history with one of the party members was awfully convenient, I'm willing to let it slide since it made for some great emotional moments and is also a very anime thing to do. I think the successor of the Claw gets the shortest straw there, as she doesn't appear outside of Yakumo's memories, while we've had the time to get to know and invest in Nicola and Ava before their respective boss fights. And while yes, children in fiction are a cheap shortcut for emotional impact, holy hell was the Nicola arc great. The reveal that not only was he resisting the queen's influence as a successor, but also existing as a copy of himself to be with his sister tugged on my heartstrings, and I was briefly distracted in his boss fight when I realized his boss form was the cool robot he told Jack he wanted to be, with him wearing his old hat and his good ending being the emotional cherry on top. While calling the memory echoes subtle is a lot like calling Blizzard management politically savvy, there are some nuanced touches in the storytelling that I really appreciated, and that was a big one. The second is the slow burn of just who the queen is. Some people might have called it based on them being the two Hispanic characters in the entire game, but when I learned that Cruz was Silva's daughter by unlocking her blood code the first time in the game her full name is used, I was legitimately surprised and thrilled by how it recontextualized Silva's mission to kill the queen.
This creature will never hurt any of my people again.
You might say the game goes a little overboard with recontextualizing things and subverting expectations in the last act, since we find out that Silva's blood levy is to prevent the red mist from failing, as it's actually a barrier designed to protect the humans outside from revenants, only for that revelation to be subverted about 30 minutes later. Late entry villain Yuzo Mito wants to get rid of the mist, and he provides a brief glimpse at the outside world, which we see is populated by... What? Wait. No. Oh, no. For the one of you that understands what just happened, hang on while I catch everyone else up. For the rest of you, the monster we just saw was an Origami, the enemies in the God Eater franchise that apparently shares a world with Code Vein. I said earlier that this game isn't God Eater 4, and it isn't, but it's a lot closer than I thought it'd be, and having thought about this for a while, I'm not sure whether I like that or not. On the one hand, one of the game's larger mysteries is what the world outside the Red Mist is like, and it was certainly unexpected to see that resolve in a way that wasn't sequel bait. On the other, the answer to my question of what's the outside world like is we already made 3 games about it, so while it's not sequel bait, it's definitely back catalog bait. It's a connection that makes the world of Code Vein less interesting by adding more information, and probably makes it harder for follow-up games to happen, as Shift will need to figure out how another game connects to Code Vein and to God Eater. I guess that gives me my answer. I don't like that these games are connected because I want more of Code Vein, and I feel like it being a weird God Eater spin-off complicates that. It's an awkward connection to make if Shift and Bamco want Code Vein and God Eater to exist as parallel franchises, and if the intention is that Revenants will appear in the next God Eater game or vice versa, then feed me to an Origami because I'm convinced that's going to be a messy fusion. I don't want to spend any more time thinking about how my cool anime vampire game became God Eater Gaiden 30 hours in, so let's talk about the endings. There's 3 in flavors of good, neutral, and you fucked up, and to my surprise, the ending that reminded me of End of Evangelion is actually the best one, where Io absorbs the Ray clones right before the final boss and takes all the relics to become a magic tree that will provide blood beads and maintain the red mist in perpetuity. Although people with an unhealthy attraction to Io might prefer the neutral ending for some reason, this is pretty clearly the good ending because it's the only one that breaks the cycle. The Bloodbead crisis has ended and successors are no longer needed. The neutral and doing it wrong endings are kind of 2 flavors of the same result. Either you take on all of the relics yourself to maintain the mist, or you fail, Louis kills you as you become the Queen's vessel, and your party become the new successors. The neutral ending hints that you'll hold the relics forever and there won't be any need for successors, making it marginally better, but in both cases the Bloodbead crisis continues and there's been no change to the status quo. There are themes of sacrifice here that I think work, even if there's a weird hierarchy of sacrifice where the quality of ending depends on who's making it, in a way that makes me think of Fallout 3, which is something I'd prefer not to do if I can help it. After the interactive epilogue of the good ending, you set out with Louis, Yakumo, and Best Girl to explore the outside world, and I already wrote 300 words on how I feel about the outside world, so we'll leave it there. So that's Code Vein. If you absolutely must have a reductive, it's like X but Y description of it, it's less like Dark Souls but anime, and more like Bloodborne but anime. I don't think it's necessarily a phenomenal, transformative experience, but it's a good game, and I think it's worth buying on sale if you like the style or the gameplay, and it's worth buying regardless if you like both. If you're the kind of person who likes anime and challenging action RPGs and is really into vampires, you should go buy this game right now, and probably write the developers a thank you letter for making a game that caters to you specifically. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to clear my browser history, order some pizza, and start a Twitter campaign to see about getting that Domino's sign back in the game.
Spreading out before me, a paradise of rubble, crumbling, struggling, longs to be reborn. But somewhere in